Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 1 year since EPA's PFAS roadmap, updates and preparation for 2023. First, I would like to thank our sponsors of today's webinar, CMBG3 Law Firm and RHP Risk Management are the sponsors. And also before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you are looking for CLE for today's webinar, please make note of the 3 CLE codes that I will put into the chat box throughout this 90-minute webinar. When we complete the webinar, I will send you an email with a link where you can apply for CLE credit, and you will need those 3 codes. We will also send the materials out after the presentation, so you will have those as well. I'll send them by email. If you have any questions for the panelists, please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and the panelists will answer them at the end of the presentation as time permits. Now I'm going to introduce Frank Pagone, who will begin our presentation today. Frank?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon as we discuss updates and preparations to consider 1 year since the EPA published the PFAS strategic roadmap. In particular, we'll cover status of action items within the roadmap, legal updates, trends and claims and best practices for risk management, and the role of historical insurance. As Amy mentioned, my name is Frank Pagone, and I am a manager and certified industrial hygienist at RHP Risk Management in Chicago, Illinois. As a certified industrial hygienist and with a background in human health risk assessment, I provide support, execution of environmental health and safety services, defining, analyzing, characterizing, assessing, and managing both occupational and non-occupational risks to human health and the environment. Today, I will be discussing the PFAS regulatory landscape as it pertains to updates since the EPA PFAS strategic roadmap. On October 18th, 2021, the EPA announced the release of the PFAS strategic roadmap, which set anticipated timelines and key action items to be completed across EPA programs. Throughout my presentation today, I'll review the key action items listed within the roadmap under specific EPA programs and highlight any updates made since October of 2021 when it was released. With this, I'll also expand on current or future implications for a number of these action items. Key actions presented for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention included topics such as Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, a national PFAS testing strategy, and toxic release inventory reporting with an ongoing robust review for processes for new PFAS. Regarding the national PFAS testing strategy and TSCA, EPA issued its first test order under the testing strategy in June of 2022. For this first test order, EPA selected 6,2-fluorotelomere sulfonamide betaine, which is a chemical substance used to make commercial firefighting foam. Companies subject to the test order may conduct the test as described in the order, such as testing the physical chemical properties and health effects following exposures such as inhalation, or provide EPA with existing information that they believe the EPA has not identified. In March of 2022, EPA issued an open letter to manufacturers, processors, distributors, users, and those that dispose of fluorinated containers to raise awareness of PFAS formation and migration. Additionally, EPA issued a notice for public comment that would remove 12 chemicals identified as PFAS from the current list of approved inert ingredients. For the fiscal year 2020, the National Defense Authorization Act immediately added 172 PFAS to the list of chemicals covered by the Toxic Release Inventory, or TRI. As an update to this list, 4 additional PFAS chemicals were added for each of the 2021 and 2022 reporting year. Key actions presented for the Office of Water included expanding PFAS monitoring in drinking water, publishing health advisories and toxicity assessments for PFAS chemicals, and restricting PFAS discharges. In addition, they also listed monitoring aquatic life, establishing a national primary drinking water regulation for PFOA, PFOA, and published updates to laboratory analytical methods. On December 27th, 2021, the 5th Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR 5, was published. and that will require samples to be collected at public water systems between 2023 and 2025 for 29 PFAS chemicals and lithium using analytical methods developed by the EPA and consensus organizations. For the Safe Drinking Water Act requires that once every 5 years, the EPA issue a list of unregulated contaminants to be monitored by public water systems. Note, this is not the first time PFAS chemicals have been included in the UCMR, as chemicals such as PFOA and PFOS were in UCMR 3. Shortly after release of the PFAS strategic roadmap, EPA published a final human health toxicity assessment for Gen X chemicals, which underwent both a peer review and public comment. Currently, PFOA, PFOS, and PFBS have toxicity values, while PFBA and PFHXA are currently in their draft form. In April 2022, EPA issued a memo addressing PFAS discharges, and the EPA issued National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, permit. For federally issued permits, EPA will include requirements to monitor for PFAS, requirements to use best management practices like product substitution and good housekeeping, and establish practices to address PFAS-containing firefighting foams in stormwater. EPA also proposed the first Clean Water Act water quality aquatic life criteria for PFAS, focusing on PFOA and PFOS, and continues to work on long-term efforts to set a nationwide technology-based standard for certain PFAS discharges under the Effluent Limitations Guidelines program. In June of 2022, EPA released 4 drinking water health advisories for PFAS. As defined by the EPA, health advisories are values or levels identified with a concentration of contaminant in drinking water at which adverse health effects and/or aesthetic effects are not anticipated to occur over specific exposure durations. As you see in this table with a list of summary of chemicals, you see the health advisories stated for PFOA, PFOS, Gen X chemicals, and PFBS. Health advisories are non-regulatory and reflect EPA's assessment of the best available peer-reviewed science. Proposed drinking water maximum contaminant levels for PFOA and PFOS are expected in December 2022, or this month, with the final rule projected in December 2023. Absent MCLs for PFOA and PFOS, the regulatory landscape for PFAS compounds in drinking water consists of an array of widely varying state promulgated standards and regulations, and these values vary by state and can be found at the state level. The Drinking Water Contaminant Candidate List, or CCL, is a list of contaminants that are currently not subject to any proposed or promulgated national primary drinking water regulation, but are known or anticipated to occur in public water systems. The EPA uses the CCL to identify priority contaminants for regulatory decision-making and information collection. The final CCL5 list, published on November 14th, includes 3 chemical groups, including PFAS, cyanotoxins, and disinfection byproducts, as well as 66 individual chemicals and 12 microbes. The EPA's Office of Water, in partnership with the Department of Defense, published Draft Method 1633, which is a single laboratory validated method to test for 40 PFAS compounds in wastewater, surface water, groundwater, soil, biosolids, sediment, landfill leachate, and fish tissue. The Office of Water has encouraged laboratories, regulatory authorities, and other interested parties to review and use the draft method with the understanding that this is subject to revision. Key actions presented for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention included designation of certain PFAS chemicals as CERCLA hazardous substances and updating guidance on destroying and disposing certain PFAS and PFAS-containing materials. In October of 2021, in response to a petition by the New Mexico governor, EPA announced steps towards evaluating existing data for PFOA, PFOS, PFBS, and Gen X under RCRA, and clarification of regulations that the RCRA Corrective Action Program has the authority to require investigation and cleanup for waste that meet the statutory definition of hazardous waste. More recently, on August 26, 2022, EPA issued a proposal to designate two of the most widely used PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, as hazardous substances under CERCLA or Superfund. Once finalized, these designations as CERCLA hazardous substances would require facilities across the country to report on PFOA and PFOS releases that meet or exceed the reportable quantity assigned to these substances, enhance the ability of federal, tribal, nations, state, and local authorities to obtain information regarding the location and extent of releases, as well as allow EPA and other agencies to respond to release or threats of release of PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances without making a determination of imminent and substantial danger. The final rule is planned for August of 2023. Prior to the release of the EPA strategic roadmap, the EPA released for public comment the new interim guidance on destroying and disposing of certain PFAS and PFAS-containing materials that are not consumer products. Research continues on proper destruction and disposal, with the EPA required to publish a final guidance by December of 2023. Within the EPA interim destruction and disposal guidance, liquid phase materials such as aqueous film forming foam or AFFF can be disposed through underground injection or destroyed through the thermal treatment. However, incineration of PFAS and AFFF has been banned in multiple states and suspended by the DoD. Additionally, the EPA also indicates that these materials can be stored until additional studies on disposal techniques have been completed. This, of course, has led to the increased need for additional research on appropriate disposal or destruction techniques and alternative product considerations. Alternative firefighting materials include fluorine-free firefighting foams or dry chemical agents, each with their own performance strengths and limitations, which should certainly be considered before proceeding with an alternative. The Office of Air and Radiation continues to build technical foundations to address PFAS and air emissions and the foundation for potential Clean Air Act regulations. And key ongoing action items for the Office of Research and Development include developing and validating methods to detect and measure PFAS, advance the science to assess human health and environmental risks for PFAS, and evaluate and develop technologies for reducing PFAS in the environment. As a way to assess human health and environmental risk, the EPA has developed a systematic evidence map to characterize available evidence for 9,000 PFAS, which was published in a peer-reviewed manuscript. The SEM, which is available online, is an interactive table that can be filtered to highlight health studies relative to specific PFAS chemistries. As shown in the image here, you see an example of the table as well as the publication. In April, EPA's Office of Water published a draft method 1621, which is a single laboratory validated method to screen for organofluorines in wastewater. The method is labeled as a screening method because it does not quantify all organofluorines with the same accuracy and has some known interferences. Several pharmaceuticals and some pesticides contain fluorine, but don't meet the EPA's definition of PFAS. The method tells the user that organofluorines are present, but does not identify which organofluorines are present. The strength of the method is that it can broadly screen for thousands of known PFAS at the parts per billion level in water samples. In May of 2022, EPA also added 5 PFAS to a list of risk-based values for site cleanups. These values, known as regional screening levels and regional remedial management levels, help the EPA determine if response or remediation activities are needed for Superfund and other agency programs to investigate contamination. Key actions and timeframe presented across programs include engaging and educating the public, identifying PFAS categories, establishing a PFAS voluntary stewardship program, which has already been established, and using enforcement tools to better identify and address PFAS releases. In January, EPA issued information request letters to 3 PFAS manufacturers, requiring that these companies provide information on their current and past PFAS production. And in November, issued an administrative order requiring a manufacturer to sample and provide treatment for PFAS contamination in drinking water near the manufacturing facility. As of November 17th, the EPA has published an annual progress report, which identifies progress under the PFAS strategic roadmap. Since the roadmap was released in 2021, the EPA has completed a number of notable actions worth repeating, including proposing to designate PFOA and PFOS as CERCLA hazardous substances, releasing drinking water health advisories, increasing data collection with UCMR5, and distributing funding to address emerging contaminants under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Upcoming, EPA is expected to propose a national drinking water standard for PFOA and PFOS, complete the CERCLA designations, restrict upstream discharges through effluent limitation guidelines, and address PFAS and biosolids, as well as provide analytical tools to the public that they can access online, interactive maps, for instance. Really, with the changing regulatory landscape, it's important to stay abreast on emerging science and developing emerging science, as well as developing federal actions related to PFAS. The regulatory landscape regarding PFAS chemicals is really rapidly evolving, as we're seeing with the strategic roadmap. And really, the evolution has numerous and wide-ranging implications that could result really in substantial fines and responsibility for mitigation.